Idaho Territory, July 1873. The first insult came just before noon, as the sun beat down on the dusty main street of Silver Creek, and Teagan Avery's 6-year-old daughter came stumbling into the mercantile with tears streaking her cheeks and a broken flower in her hand. "They laughed at me," Olive sobbed, clutching the crushed daisy like it could shield her. "They said my name sounds like something you eat. They said it's stupid." Teagan dropped the spool of thread she had been holding and knelt down, wrapping her arms around her daughter, her heart twisted. She had named her Olive because it meant peace. Because after all the fire and heartbreak that had followed her out of Missouri, peace was all she had wanted. "Who said that to you?" she asked quietly. Olive sniffled. "The Brunner boys and 2 others. They said I must be named after a jar." Teagan pressed her lips to the crown of Olive's head. "You listened to me. Your name is beautiful, it's strong, like you." But Olive only cried harder. She did not see him at first. Not until the bell above the door jingled and the wooden boards creaked under the weight of boots far more worn than anyone else's in town. Teagan turned, still crouched beside Olive, and looked up into the face of a man she had not seen in nearly 6 years. "Teagan," his voice was low, a little rough. He looked older than she remembered, but the eyes were the same pale blue that had once made her 17-year-old heart stumble. "Is that you, Paxton Whitlow?" she breathed, rising slowly. "I thought you were still riding the cattle trails up near Montana." "Was," he said, glancing down at Olive. "Then I heard the Avery girl lived out here, could not quite believe it." Teagan felt her cheeks warm. "We came 2 years ago, after my father passed. I bought a small cabin west of the creek. You always did like the mountains better than the cities," he said, smiling faintly. His eyes flicked again to Olive, who now clung to Teagan's skirt. "This your girl?" Teagan nodded. "Her name is Olive." Olive peered up at him. "Are you a cowboy?" He crouched so he was eye level with her. "I am." Then, after a moment, "And Olive is a mighty fine name." Her lip wobbled. Everyone laughed at it. Paxton stood and looked toward the open door. "Well, let us fix that." "What do you mean?" Teagan asked, wary. He turned to her, one brow raised. "You still afraid of horses?" She blinked. "No." "Good." He reached out his hand. "Come on, Teagan, let us show this town what proud looks like." She stared at his hand. It had been 6 years. 6 years since he had kissed her behind the barn and promised to come back. Then the war had ended and he had ridden north, and she had been left with a child and no word. But now he stood here, offering not apologies or explanations, but something else entirely. A chance to reclaim the pride this town had tried to strip from her daughter. She took his hand out on the street. The sun was still high, the dirt warm under her boots. Paxton helped Teagan up onto the saddle first, then reached down and lifted Olive with ease, settling her in front of him. Then he swung up behind them both, one arm wrapped protectively around Olive's waist, his other steadying the reins. They rode slow down the center of Silver Creek, past the saloon, the smithy, the mercantile, and the schoolhouse. People stopped and stared. The Brunner boys froze on the edge of the general store steps, slack-jawed. "Her name is Olive," Paxton called out, his voice calm but firm. "And it is a damn fine name." Teagan looked down at her daughter, who blinked up at him with something like awe. By the time they reached the end of the street, Olive sat taller, her chin lifted. She turned her head slightly toward her mother and whispered, "He is strong." Teagan smiled. "He is." They rode back toward her cabin after that, quiet but not uncomfortable. The trees stirred in the wind. The creek babbled somewhere nearby. It all felt strangely like home. Paxton helped them down, then tied the horse to the post and looked around. "You fixed this place up nice." "I did what I could," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It is not much, but it is ours." He looked at her then, really looked. "You did all this on your own," Teagan nodded. "I had to." Paxton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he crouched beside Olive, who had picked up a stick and was poking at a patch of ants. "Want to help me brush down my horse?" she grinned. "Really, really." Teagan watched them walk toward the stable together, her heart strangely full. The man she had once loved was still that man, a little more weathered but steady, kind. And somehow, in this wild stretch of land, fate had brought them back together. That evening, after Olive had fallen asleep with her head on the windowsill, Paxton stayed. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, staring out into the dusk. Teagan stepped outside, arms folded against the cooling air. "You always had a way of showing up when I least expected it," she said softly. "I wanted to come back sooner." His voice was rough again. "I got your letters, every one of them. But I thought you were better off without a drifter like me. You thought wrong." He turned to her. "I see that now." The silence stretched, but it was not empty. "You going to stay this time?" she asked. He looked at her, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "If you will have me." She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never stopped." He leaned down then, slow and certain, and kissed her. It was not rushed, it was not desperate. It was the kind of kiss that said, "I am here now, I am not going anywhere." Inside, Olive stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft. The stars came out one by one, and on a quiet evening in Idaho Territory, the pieces of a long, broken heart began to come back together. The next morning, Teagan found Paxton already out back, splitting kindling with a rhythm that told of years spent working with his hands, not just riding trails but building shelter when there was no one else to do it. Olive sat nearby on a low stump, nibbling on a piece of dried apple as she watched him with wide-eyed interest. Teagan stepped onto the porch, tying back her hair with a strip of calico. "She's never been so quiet this early." Paxton didn't pause. "Said she wanted to see if I'd miss and take my own boot off." "You're not far off," Olive replied, licking her fingers. "You almost did when the blade stuck." He grinned without looking up. "You're a sharp one." "She gets that from her mother," Teagan said, walking down the steps. The morning air still held a trace of night's coolness, dew clinging to the wild grasses near the barn. Nothing about the land was easy, but it had a kind of quiet honesty to it, something she hadn't found in people for a long time. "Do you plan on leaving again?" Olive asked suddenly. Her tone wasn't accusing, but it carried a weight that made Paxton lower the axe. He wiped his hands on his trousers and sat on the stump beside her. "I don't plan on going anywhere unless your mama chases me off." Olive looked to Teagan. "Will you?" Teagan crossed her arms, not out of anger but because the question deserved a real answer. "I don't believe he spooks so easy." Paxton's eyes found hers, and his nod was slight, but it said more than a paragraph could. Later that day, Teagan walked to the neighboring homestead to trade for eggs, leaving Olive in Paxton's care. She didn't ask if he could manage something in her gut, already knew he would. When she returned, they were down by the creek. Olive had her shoes off and was hopping from stone to stone, arms out like wings. Paxton stood ankle deep in the water, holding her hand when she wobbled, letting go when she righted herself. "She always like this?" he asked, glancing up as Teagan approached. "Only when she forgets to be careful. She's fearless. She has to be." They watched her for a while, the water catching bits of sunlight between the stones. Paxton's voice was low when he said, "I never knew about her. If I had..." Teagan didn't let him finish. "You couldn't have known." "I stopped writing after the last letter came back unopened. I figured you were gone one way or another." "I nearly was," he said. "Winter of '68, got caught outside Helena, sick as I've ever been. A Sioux woman pulled me out of the snow. I stayed with her family till spring." Teagan turned to him. "You never married?" "No," he shook his head. "I carried your name too long for another to fit." Her breath caught, not from surprise she'd wondered, but from the simple truth of it spoken so plainly. They sat together on the bank while Olive built a line of pebbles across the shallows. Paxton picked up a flat stone and flicked it across the surface. It skipped 4 times before it sank. "She's strong," he said. "She had to be," Teagan replied. He looked sideways at her. "Same's true of you." She didn't answer right away. The sound of water and Olive's humming filled the space between them. "I don't need saving, Paxton. I didn't come to save you. I came because I couldn't stop thinking about what I left behind." She turned to face him. "You left because you thought you had to. I stayed away longer than I should have." His jaw tightened, then eased. "But I'm here now, if you'll let me be." Before she could reply, Olive let out a laugh as her pebble dam gave way, water rushing through the path she'd blocked. "It's like a flood," she shouted. Teagan smiled, rising to her feet. "Come on, Olive, let's get you dry before supper." That night, while the girl slept curled in her quilt, Teagan stood at the window, her arms resting on the sill. The stars were clearer than the night before. Paxton leaned against the doorframe behind her, his presence quiet but grounded. "I'm not the same girl from Missouri," she said, "I know. And you're not the same boy who kissed me behind the barn." "No," he agreed, "but I think we're better now." She turned to him and he stepped closer. Not with urgency, but with something steadier, something earned. "I've got a small herd up near Payette," he said. "A few head, nothing grand, but the land's good, water's clean. I could build you both a house with a porch facing the river." Teagan held his gaze. "And if I don't want to leave this cabin, then I'll build one here." She didn't answer with words, just reached out, took his hand, and let it settle over hers. Outside, the wind shifted. The pines leaned toward one another like they were listening. Inside, the distance between two people who'd once been strangers again narrowed, inch by inch, toward something lasting. By the third week, Paxton had moved his few belongings into the low-roofed shed beside the barn. He didn't ask to sleep inside the cabin, and Teagan didn't offer. Some things needed to settle in their own time, but every morning he was out before dawn, checking the fence line or smoothing the ruts on the slope behind the house where the spring runoff had clawed the earth raw. He never waited for thanks. Olive had taken to him quick. Not in the way of a child desperate for attention, but with the quiet trust of someone who recognized steadiness when she saw it. She trailed him to the woodpile, listened close when he explained how to tell a rabbit track from a fox's. At night, she curled against Teagan's side with her eyes drooping and hair tangled from wind and sun. One evening, after Olive had gone to bed early from chasing a knotted string through the grass like it was a kite tail, Teagan stepped out to the porch and found Paxton sitting on the edge, legs stretched long, hat in his lap. The moon was rising slow behind the ridge, pale gold and wide as a basin. She lowered herself beside him without speaking. He ran a thumb along the brim of his hat. "I wired a man out in Payette, asked him to drive the herd down." Teagan kept her gaze on the trees beyond the clearing. "You mean to stay for good, then?" "I do," she nodded. "That cabin you mentioned on your land, you still mean to build it?" "I'd rather build it here, if that's what you want." "I haven't decided," she said, though the truth was already curling in her chest, warm and certain. They sat together until the crickets came up in chorus. "Your hands," she said after a while, "they've changed. You used to carry a fiddle string in your pocket." "I still do, just never found much reason to play it." She turned to look at him. "You could find one now." His mouth tugged, not into a smile, but something quieter. "You remember that tune I used to hum? You played it under the kitchen window the night before you left." "I never played it again." Teagan traced the grain in the porch post beside her. "I used to hum it to Olive when she was fussing. She never liked lullabies, but that one calmed her." He looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "That's the first thing I ever wrote." "You," her brows lifted. "I never told anyone, just needed something to keep my fingers from going idle." He paused. "Funny how things carry." The air cooled as the night deepened. Teagan stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I've got an extra fiddle inside. It was my father's. Needs tuning, but it's got good wood. I'd like to see it." She left the door open as she went in, and he followed, careful to keep quiet as they passed the small room where Olive slept. The fiddle was wrapped in an oilcloth on the shelf above the hearth. Teagan handed it to him, watching as he unwrapped it like it was something fragile. He sat on the edge of the table and plucked each string, adjusting the pegs with practiced care. Then, without preamble, he drew the bow across and let the first note spill into the room. It wasn't the old tune. It was something slower, more hesitant, like a memory searching for its shape. Teagan leaned against the wall, arms folded, letting the sound wrap around her. He stopped after a few bars. "Lost it somewhere along the way. It'll come back." He nodded once, then set the fiddle down gently. "I want to ask you something." She tilted her head. "I don't aim to crowd you, Teagan, but I've been thinking if I'm to stay and you're willing to let me, then I'd like to make things proper." She didn't speak right away. The weight of the question hung between them, not rushed, not assumed. She stepped closer, close enough to see the crease beside his eye, the way he hadn't quite shaved that morning. "You want to marry me?" "I do." "And you'd take Olive as your own?" He didn't blink. "She already feels like mine." Teagan reached out, resting her fingers on the fiddle's neck. "I haven't let anyone in since you. I'll never leave again." "I believe you." She didn't say yes, but she didn't have to. Instead, she leaned in and rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, not like a man claiming something, but like one finally coming home. In the other room, Olive stirred. Teagan pulled back, brushing a hand over her hair. She'll be up wanting breakfast before the rooster even thinks about crowing. I'll start the fire. She watched him walk to the hearth and kneel, striking the flint with the sureness of someone who knew his place now, knew what it meant to be needed, to belong. Outside, the wind shifted through the pines, and the night held fast around them. Not sharp, not uncertain, just steady, just whole. The wedding took place 3 weeks later under the cottonwoods that lined the edge of the pasture, just beyond the reach of the creek. It was quiet, without fuss or lace, just the three of them and the preacher who came in from the next town over with dust on his boots and a Bible tucked beneath one arm. Olive wore a wreath of dried clover and yarrow that she'd twisted herself, her fingers stained yellow from the stems. Teagan's dress was the same one she'd worn to her father's funeral, but this time she'd let the collar down and pinned her hair in a soft coil behind her neck. Paxton had washed and brushed his coat, and though the color had faded from years under sun and rain, it looked right on him, honest, worn, dependable. When the preacher finished the last words, Olive reached up and took one of Paxton's hands in hers. "Does this mean we're a whole now?" Paxton crouched beside her. "We've been a whole a while, this just makes it official." Afterward, they shared a meal of cornbread, cold ham, and the last of the preserved apples. Olive insisted on serving pieces herself and handed Paxton the largest slice with both hands. "Because you're the tallest," she said, as if that were enough explanation. He accepted it with a nod that made her beam. That night, once Olive had fallen asleep curled against a quilt she'd sewn with Teagan from leftover fabric scraps, Paxton stood at the doorway, looking out over the pasture lit silver by the moon. Teagan joined him, her shoulder brushing his. "You're quiet, just thinking about," he glanced down at her, "whether I'll be any good at this." "At what?" "Being husband, being father, being still." She leaned into him. "You don't have to be perfect." "Just true. I can do that." They stood like that for a time, the hush of the land settling around them like a second skin. A pair of nighthawks passed low overhead, their wings carving the dark. In the weeks that followed, Paxton began building a second room onto the cabin, hammering each plank with deliberate care. He set the foundation further back, so Olive would have a space of her own when she grew older and needed it. Teagan helped when she could, hauling boards and smoothing pitch between the seams. Olive brought them water and stayed near, always watching. One morning she approached while Teagan was sweeping dust from the porch. "Mama, can I ask something?" Teagan rested the broom against the wall. "Course." Olive picked at the hem of her dress. "At school, when they ask about my name, should I tell them the flower part or what it means?" Teagan crouched so they were eye level. "Tell them what it means to you." Olive nodded slowly. "It means we don't hide." "That's right." At supper that evening, Paxton mentioned a neighbor who had lost a mule and was looking for help with the next cattle drive. "Just a few days' ride. He's an old friend, said he'd pay fair." Teagan looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You want to go?" "I'd like to earn my keep, bring something back for the house." "You already bring more than enough." He reached across the table, his calloused fingers brushing hers. Still, Olive looked between them. "Can I help while he's gone?" Teagan smiled. "You already do." The morning Paxton left, he tied a red cloth to the gatepost outside the barn. "So you know I'll be back," he told Olive. She stood on the fence rail and saluted. "You better be. We haven't finished the part of the roof that leaks." He leaned down and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh, then turned to Teagan. 3 days ride out, 2 back. I'll be home by the 7th morning." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He pressed a kiss to her forehead and mounted up. The sun was just rising as he rode away, his silhouette framed by the golden edge of the hills. 6 mornings passed. On the 7th, just as the frost was beginning to lift off the grass, a rider appeared on the ridge. Olive saw him first. "Mama." "He's back." Teagan stepped onto the porch, her heart thundering. Paxton rode in slow, his saddlebags full and his face windburned, but his eyes found hers and didn't stray. He dismounted and unbuckled the bags without a word, handing Olive a wrapped bundle. "For the roof," he said. She pulled it open to reveal a small hammer with a carved wooden handle, her initials etched into the side. "Best gift I ever got," she whispered. Teagan waited until Olive ran toward the barn to examine it in better light before stepping forward. "You came back early," he shook his head. "Right on time." She reached up and touched his jaw, rough with travel. "You bring something for me?" He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to her. Inside was a deed 5 acres of land that backed up to the creek, the same plot her father had once dreamed of buying but never could. "I want us to have something that's ours," he said. "Not borrowed, not promised, just real." She looked up at him, eyes wet. "It already is." Behind them, Olive climbed onto the porch railing and declared, "Now we can build the rest of the house. But this time, I get to pick where the windows go." Paxton laughed, the sound low and full as the sunrise spilled across the field, and in that stretch of land carved by wind and want, the three of them stood together, no longer waiting for a life to begin, but already living it. The first snow came early that year. Not a storm, just a hush of white that softened the fields and lined the branches like lace. Teagan tightened the window shutters while Olive stood barefoot by the fire, warming her toes and humming tunelessly as she strung dried cranberries and corn husks for the mantel. Paxton came in from the barn with a bundle of cedar slung over one shoulder. He kicked the snow from his boots and set the wood down by the hearth, brushing flakes from his coat. Teagan was already ladling stew into bowls. "I passed your neighbor on the ridge," he said, setting his gloves near the fire to dry. "He asked after you. Said he's heard tell of a woman who can fix a drafty wall better than any man he's hired." Teagan raised her brow as she set a bowl in front of him. "Did you offer to sell my services?" "I told him he'd best offer pie first, apple if he's smart." Olive giggled. "Mama doesn't fix walls for pie." "She might for the right crust," Paxton said, winking at Teagan. She shook her head, but her mouth curved. The stew was thick with rabbit and root vegetables, and they ate in the quiet that always settled when the weather turned. After supper, Paxton pulled a worn deck of cards from the shelf and taught Olive a counting game while Teagan mended the cuff of his shirt by lamplight. Later, when Olive had gone to sleep in the new room they'd finished just before the frost, Teagan stepped out onto the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The moon hung low and full, dusting the snow-covered fields in silver. Paxton joined her, handing her a mug of warm cider, his fingers brushing hers. "You ever think you'd end up here?" he asked, voice low against the cold. "Not once," she said, "but I never thought I'd have peace either." He leaned against the post beside her. "Got a letter last week. That family up near Salmon River, the Miwoks, I stayed with their offering to sell their cattle. No one left to tend them but an old uncle who says he's ready to rest." She looked over at him. "You thinking of buying?" "I'm thinking we could double what we've got. Lease some grazing land east of here and drive the herd ourselves come spring. You'd be gone weeks at a time." "Not without you." He glanced toward the door. "Or her." Teagan rubbed the rim of her cup with her thumb. "I've never been more than 3 days' ride from this place since Olive was born. There's time. The offer stands till thaw." She nodded, letting the idea settle. "We'd need a second wagon. And stronger mules. I've already asked around." She smiled, not at the plan, but at the way he said we like it had always been that way, like it always would be. That night, they lay together for the first time in the room at the back of the house, where the roof sloped low and the cedar walls still smelled of fresh cut wood. Paxton's touch was quiet, reverent, not rushed or uncertain. Teagan moved toward him without fear, without weight. They were not patching something broken. They were building something whole. In the morning, Olive found them sipping coffee at the kitchen table, heads bent close, both of them barefoot and still wrapped in the warmth of sleep. "Are we going to the river today?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Teagan looked to Paxton, then back at her daughter. "Not today, but soon. We've got plans to make." By early spring, the snow had thinned and the streams ran fast with meltwater. Paxton bought the Miwok cattle and hired a young couple from Boys Basin to stay on the land while they traveled. Teagan traded the old wagon for a sturdier rig with iron-banded wheels, and Olive helped pack dried beans and cornmeal into cloth sacks. They left before sunup on the last day of March, the three of them bundled against the morning chill. their wagon creaking over the still damp earth. The road was long, but they made camp each night near water, and Paxton sang low while Olive fell asleep under wool blankets and starlight. They reached the Salmon River in 12 days. The cattle were lean but healthy, and the land stretched wide and green, bordered by stone ridges and pine. Teagan stood at the edge of the pasture with her hands on her hips, watching Olive chase a crow in the tall grass. "She belongs to the land," Paxton said, coming up beside her. "So do we," she answered. They stayed through the summer, driving the herd to market in small groups, taking turns sleeping under the wagon and cooking over open flame. Paxton taught Olive how to tie knots and measure distance by the sun. Teagan traded with the neighboring Nez Perce for herbs and sweet root, and in return gave them a basket of dried apples and a set of strong needles from her kit. By the time the first leaves turned, they had saved enough to stake claim on the land near the river, 4 miles from the place where Paxton had nearly died years earlier. He built a house with a wide porch and a loft for Olive, while Teagan planted rows of sage and wildflowers along the edge of the barn. On the first frost of the new year, Paxton carved their names into the beam above the hearth. Olive added a drawing of a daisy beside it, careful and slow. That night, with the fire burning low and the wind whispering through the eaves, Teagan curled beside Paxton beneath a quilt stitched from scraps of all they'd lived through. "You ever miss the trail?" she asked. "Not once," he said, kissing her temple. "I've already arrived." And in that quiet house beside the river, with the cattle in the valley and the girl asleep above them, they held to each other like roots to earth. It was not the life they thought they'd have. It was better.